what is technocracy? So we probably have some people that don't even know what this is. So Courtney, begin with telling us, first of all, what is technocracy, the origins of it, the overview of it.
So technocracy started in the 1930s as a response to the Great Depression. Actually, this was their solution to create abundance. And the very famous, Elon Musk, his grandfather was Josh Hadelman, was actually the head of Technocracy Inc. in Canada from 1936 to 1940, 1941, right before it shut down. And they, in their own words, like in there, and I think I might have that, if it's not in this most recent article, it's in my last article, but I actually have the screenshot from Technocrat magazine in 1937. They say themselves that the definition of technocracy is social engineering. So, of course, it is really, where you have the scientific elite will control everything. And they had this vision back then, but they didn't have the technology that we have today. So I think back then the ideas were scary enough. I think that was it was definitely enough to be concerned about back then. But today it's very concerning because we have the technology, we have AI, we have all of this. We have the potential for a completely tokenized world, not just economy, but really make everything tokenized. And to me, that's their end game. And I think it's the most scary aspect of all of it. But yeah, so I that's the kind of cliff notes of it. They also say themselves that the data mining, the surveillance is for the purposes of control. So just in case anybody, is confused about that, that's their own words all the way back in the 1930s. And the platform is very progressive. So they're aligned with things like UBIs, they called it energy credits. And you can find in their manual, you'd have to go to the Wayback Machine, but you can find the Technocracy study guides, and they talk about the energy certificates, which are basically carbon credits today in the language of the UN. So, yeah.
No, that's a great history. And, as we know on this channel, we've gone into a lot of the predecessors to modern technocratic movements. We've looked at Jeremy Bentham and the idea of panopticism. We've looked at the writings of H.G. Wells, Bertrand Russell, Lord Birkenhead. I'm not going to spend too much time on all that because we've covered a lot of that over the years. Of course, key texts would be things like Bertrand Russell's Impact of Science on Society. And I'm just holding this up for the benefit of the audience who may not be familiar with these texts. I know Courtney is familiar with them. Scientific Outlook by Russell as well. And then really important would be the writings of H.G. Wells that are not fiction, because when you get into books like New World Order or H.G. Wells' Open Conspiracy, we find out that technocracy isn't new.
Add world brain, yep. because they keep couching everything in decentralization. We'll get into that, but the world brain is actually, even Game B references it. So
yeah, exactly. And Jacques Attali's 2006 book Brief History of the Future gets really deep into what he thinks world brain will become and what it'll do. So let's fast forward to now, and now I've got Thiel's book over here, 0 to 1. He's got a whole chapter in there about the NSA and how they were happy to, have Palantir, and Palantir might have had a hand in helping to find Osama bin Laden and all this, which I think is a bunch of nonsense. But so in your new piece here, you talk about three things: Game B, you talk about the Dark Enlightenment, and you talk about the network state's digital secession. So let's walk through what these three things are, because I think a lot of people who maybe even know about this topic, they probably don't know about Game B.
Sure. So I kind of frame this as, they tend to work through, regardless of what you think of the political spectrum, they tend to work through left-hand, right-hand paths.
Right.
And So Game B very much operates through, at least from my estimation, the left-hand path, the Divine Mother. They're concerned about, their Gaia worshipers.
Gaia.
Yeah, exactly. They're concerned about the sustainable development goals and the climate crisis.
Like Greta type stuff.
Yes, exactly. So that's very much Game B. And a lot of the people in Game B are disciples of Barbara Marx Hubbard. Who was an intellectual disciple of Teilhard de Chardin.
Right.
Concept of the noosphere. In Game B, the term is collective intelligence. So they don't use the term noosphere specifically, but it's the same concept, same idea. And actually, some of the technologies they talk about, and some of the, they call it dialogos, which is basically like dialogues for consensus making. They also have a term called sense making, which is also dialogues for consensus making. But they talk about how they do talk about terms like the noosphere, inhabiting the intellectual noosphere. So they are pretty overt about those sorts of ideologies and how they're aligned with them. So that's kind of Game B. And to give a little backstory on Game B, since a lot of people might not be as familiar with Game B, although it's not new at all. Game B spawned out of the 2010s era. Back in, actually, I've learned a little bit more since I started researching all of this. I've seen some of the conversations with Jordan Hall, who is one of the founders of Game B, talking about how he calls Eric Weinstein the rabbi of Game B. And they met at the Perimeter Institute when Eric Weinstein was giving a speech. He was giving a speech post 2008 financial crisis. And actually in that speech, he talks about plan A and plan B in terms of economics. So I think that was kind of a little foreshadowing of what was to come. But he insisted repeatedly that Jordan Hall meet with his brother, Brett Weinstein. And the way Jordan explains it, they really didn't hit it off too much in the beginning. And there was also simultaneously these Stanton meetings in Stanton, Virginia, where Jim Rutt was hosting these. Really, they were centered around creating a new political party called the Emancipation Party. The Emancipation Party was very much in the vein of like the Forward Party, a Bernie Sanders movement. They wanted things like the UBI, Universal Basic Healthcare, those types of things. And so they met, Jordan Hall and Jim Rutt met at the Santa Fe Institute. Jim Rutt had been recruited. He was chairman of the Santa Fe Institute for a while, but he fell into that because he was working on a software called evolutionary software. And that's part of how Brett Weinstein got brought in, because he's an evolutionary biologist. So, and Jordan Hall was there. And so they started doing this political movement. The way Jim Rutt explains it is he says that he could get the boomers on board. They were all in, they loved it. He said that Gen X, he could persuade them, but he said the millennials loved the platform, but they were such anarchists that the notion of a political party was an anathema to them. And he said, well, you really can't start a political movement without the millennials. So he didn't think that there was much hope, and it wasn't going to take off the way that he had hoped. And Thor Mueller, who was part of these Stanton meetings, had said, keep the name Game B for branding. And so they did. And they kind of split, because the way Jim Rutt explains it is that he's, a hard scientist. He's a complexity theorist. I might think otherwise, but, we'll take his word. He's very mechanistic, and he's a complexity systems theorist, and that's hard science. And some of the others were a little bit more woo. These are like the Barbara Marx Hubbard disciples, people like Mark Gaffney, Daniel Schmachtenberger, who are in this movement. And they've reconvened, though, in like the 2013, 2014. They, decided to move forward with trying to create Game B, which they call a new operating system for civilization. And so they proceeded, and I had this theory that the intellectual dark web was an influence operation for Game B. And I actually found an article in Manifest Nirvana from Andrew Cohen, and he pretty much says that. He doesn't use those words. Those are my words. That's a little heavy-handed. I don't think he would say it was an influence operation, but that's pretty much what he says. He says that the intellectual dark web laid the groundwork for the audience to acquiescence to the ideas of Game B. So it kind of seeded that ground. So that is Game B, and we can go into more of the details on it. But then through the right-hand path, and a lot more people are familiar with it because so many of them are influencing and surrounding the Trump administration currently, we have the Dark Enlightenment. And I thought it was so funny because it was a couple of weeks ago, CNN did this little short clip about Curtis Yarvin. He said, there's this blogger. He's been blogging for over a decade. I'm like, almost two, but who's counting? Apparently not them. But he said, but it's very concerning because he has a lot of influence on the Trump administration, which is true. And the Dark Enlightenment operates, when I say right-hand path, more of the patriarchal kind of autocratic, very like a kind of muscular type of energy. And they are very influential in the current Trump administration, which is supposedly right-hand path, right? He was under the Republican banner. And they really want to create, what they call, Curtis Yarvin calls it the Sovcorp's Nick Land, who is kind of advanced this concept of the Dark Enlightenment, also known as the neo-reactionary movement. He was also the progenitor of the accelerationist movement, and he calls it GovCorp. But they're essentially very similar concepts, just operating under different marketing banners, I would say. The game B is more of your soft power kind of opt-in tyranny, where you have the illusion of everything being decentralized and you have complete voluntary, authority and sovereignty, personal sovereignty and agency. But they are going to create this collective intelligence, and that it will be re-centralized that way. And through the Dark Enlightenment, it's more of a top-down. In fact, Curtis Yarvin himself says that the problem with America is the government needs a reboot, and that we need to get over our fear of the dictator, and it should operate like a CEO running a company, that he is the dictator. And so that's kind of his concept. The idea of retire all government employees, he calls it RAGE, was very influential on this Doge operation. Although
have you seen the movie that The Watchmen, based on the Alan Moore famous graphic novel?
I don't think I have. No.
Yeah, in that story, Alan Moore, who himself was kind of a committed Crowleyan, he has this character named Ozymandias, who is this tech sort of, he's like a business CEO mogul magnate, and his idea is kind of like, it's time to just kind of take over and let, CEO, tech, philosopher kings run everything. And it kind of gets into this idea of like, it's not explicitly technocracy, but it's kind of like it's sort of like that. And it's kind of the idea is that he needs to massively depopulate, the planet. Like half of the planet needs to go away so that we can have a time of peace. And so this vision reminds me of what Alan Moore is kind of getting at. And I think the key point here that a lot of people, I want to be very clear about being nuanced, because, my audience is going to take issue with some of the things that you're going to argue, which is fine, not a big deal. I think that, for example, I want to get into the Christian nationalism part, because I want to be really precise. I believe that the ideal government should be, in a Christian majority society, laws that reflect the belief system of the majority Christian people. That's my position. That does not mean that I think that we need to sort of subvert, take over the country, change everything, reboot everything into some kind of like Byzantine theocratic model. I don't think any of that's realistic. I also believe that a lot of the movements that would come forward as Christian nationalists, Protestants, and these kinds of people, I would never trust those movements. I would assume that those movements are from the outset probably co-opted or funded or created. So, because most movements, don't come out of nowhere. Movements generally have funding, and if they are generally organic, typically they can easily be bought and taken over. So, being very precise, I do believe in the form of government of a kind of Christian monarchy where there's limitations on the state. I do not believe that today's Christian nationalist movements represent some authentic vision of something that I would support, although I'm sure there's many people that are sincere in that. I just know from my Protestant background that a lot of the goofballs that I was involved in as a young Protestant who believed in this sort of Christian nationalist stuff are just clowns, or feds, or worse. So being very precise then, where we come in here with Courtney's point, which I think a lot of people in this audience would probably agree with, even if they take issue with some of the pro-enlightenment stances of the article. The puppet master type tech people, they know these movements and these ideas, and what they want to do is seize upon the trends and where the winds are blowing to steer that into something which, in the case of, say, Curtis Yarvin, seems to be just another kind of atheist, nihilist, Nietzschean tech bro control grid as well. I mean, is that kind of what you're getting from your research?
Yeah, and it gets way worse when you add Nick Land, because Nick Land is pretty much a straight up occultist. He was one of the forerunners of the CCRU, which is the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit at Warwick University. And I have some links actually that are really hard to find. I did quite a bit of digging in the way back, and one of them is like xenosystems.demon. .uk, and he's got all sorts of ideas about, essentially demon type, using fictionalized kind of labels, but it very much demonology, in order to influence the direction of the future. And he's very influenced by people like Lovecraft and Julius Evola. And he has this whole idea of technoplastic beings. He has this idea of, accelerationism, just for people who are not familiar, is essentially this theory that he thinks capitalism is doomed, it's going to fail. He's not a proponent of it, but he thinks that we should use it in order to push it to its nth degree so it can reach its apocalyptic state much faster, and that we should use technology to do that. And so that's what his whole thesis is around. It's that we're having
Quick question here. Now, we've done some interviews with BX on Twitter. I don't know if you're familiar with her, but she's come on InfoWars with me a few times, I think, and she's been on with Harrison Smith too. And she talks about accelerationism having a lot of overlaps with these sort of online satanic cults. Do you think that's also kind of going on here as well? Is there a sort of I get the impression from, I don't know Nick Land's philosophy that well. I did hear him on a couple podcasts of some friends of ours, and I think they were just talking about Nietzsche. They weren't really going into accelerationism, but it seems like the idea is pretty wicked. Like, oh, let's collapse everything quicker so that we can have the new thing come in. But the thing about that is, like, what they want to bring in is probably going to be worse than the worst parts of what we have now.
It's way worse. And I mean, Nick Land brings, through this really dark fantasy, he brings to fruition the vision of what would be this transhuman leading to a post-human world. His concept of technoplastic beings is basically, this like synthetic biology, man merging with machines kind of a vision.
So it's just straight transhumanism.
It's transhumanism. And he lays the groundwork through, a more mechanistic type of philosophy. Actually, he has a term, the mechanistic desire, which, he talks about the future of humanity is going to be reshaped by and eclipsed by technology. So essentially the singularity, right? That's his whole vision. But he's really, really dark. So yeah, I would say, Curtis Yarvin comes from, his parents were, communists. He's more of a nihilistic kind of, atheistic. That's more of his framework. And he looks at things very, it's bizarre, but it's also it's linear in a way. Like you just have a CEO, he's a dictator, he runs everything, and this is just a kind of black and white type of operating in a vacuum type of philosophy and theories. Whereas Nick Land is, he's pretty dark. The CCRU, his partner, it was founded by Sadie Plant, who's like a cyberpunk feminist. So yeah, I have a lot of.
That's such an odd pairing there. I mean, but maybe then again, maybe it's not an odd pairing.
I don't think it is, because of the concepts, like the concepts of hyperstition, where we're going to use hyperstition is like where we're going to use fictionalized ideals in order to create reality. So everything is it's just not rooted in reality. And that's the common theme I find with all of these things, like all of the concepts that I've laid out, particularly in this article, is it's not rooted in reality. It's what I call spiral metaphysics, as opposed to a plumb line. It's not anchored in anything. And I think that that's so important, because the whole goal of these technocrats, and now they're merging it with religion, and I'll touch on that, to address what you pointed out with the Christian nationalism. And I agree with you. I don't think they're authentic. I think it's a veneer. It's a facade. They're using it because, that concept of the three-legged stool, they need the religious component in order to usher in. Especially since they're operating currently in the right-hand path, which tends to be comprised of more religious oriented people.
One question: when you use the term dark enlightenment early on, are you referring to when the New York Times put out that article a while back when it was like Peterson and Sam Harris and I forget who was sitting around this big table, or using this? Is this more specifically like tech bros?
No, they were probably, I don't know what reference you're using, but they were probably talking about the Dark Enlightenment. I mean, the Dark Enlightenment comes from Curtis Yarvin. It was called the neo-reactionary movement. They called it NRX. So it's a neo-reactionary
Now,
movement.
this I do know about, but I just think when I hear Dark Enlightenment, I think of that. It was a famous New York Times piece, and they had a picture of a dinner meeting with Joe Rogan. I think Joe Rogan was there, and it was like Peterson and Sam Harris. Let me see if I can find it, and maybe Curtis Yarvin was even there. I don't remember. Let me see who was at this. New York Times. Oh, excuse me. I'm mixing this up with the intellectual dark web. I'm sorry.
Dark
I was
web.
mixing up
Which
my
I
terms. Never mind. That was a
Which I
2019
said was,
article. But actually, some of these people overlap, right? Like, isn't there
right,
some
which I
overlap?
said the intellectual dark web was a influence operation for Game B, and there is
Gotcha.
overlap. Yeah. So
My mistake. Carry on.
no, that's I would say Dark MAGA has a lot of ties to, I think that they're hearkening to the Dark Enlightenment.
Is that
whole
well? That was
concept.
that was Teal, right?
That was Elon Musk. He
Oh,
wore
never
the
mind.
Dark
I'm sorry.
MAGA hat.
Yeah. I'm totally forgetting Elon's part. Like, I'm thinking of. I'm looking at your article, and I got Peter Thiel, and I'm thinking about Yarvin, and then, but I'm totally forgetting Elon.
Elon. Yeah, so I in this article I talk about Peter Thiel as being kind of like the grandmaster architect. Now, I certainly don't think that he's like, I think there are puppet strings above him. He's only a billionaire. Like that's a lot to me, but like, I don't think he's running the world, but he's what we can see. I can speculate about the strings that are being pulled above him. I know he has some like Opus Dei ties. There's obviously his whole military industrial complex affiliations. And I think there's some Habsburg axis there. But, for what we can actually see, I was focused more on the tangible. That's also what we have some agency over, right? We can only, speculate otherwise. So, but yeah, so I talk about him as and he's also the overlapping between the two groups. So when I was saying that they're not rooted in reality, there's not, it's not a plumb line where they're anchored to anything real. I think it's so important because what essentially they want to do, in my opinion, is they want a like technological immanentization of the eschaton. So that's how I see it. Like, I think that, they're, whether they, don't think they're going to heaven, or they don't know what happens, or they're just complete nihilists. I don't know what their worldview is. I can speculate, but I'm not in their heads. But I think that they want to create heaven on earth. And so they have to make a simulacra. And that's what this whole transhuman agenda is all about. And in order to do that, you have to distort people's perceptions of reality. You have to have a constructivist worldview in order for that to functionally operate. And I think that's why these philosophies are so incredibly important for their agenda.
Yeah,
So
they're all rooted in some form of relativism where
Yep.
you kind of create your reality. And when you talk about the sort of hyperstition and the influence of these different, are you quite literally saying like they're literally taking Lovecraft and Tolkien and like saying let's use that as a way to actually create this reality? Like
Yep.
they're basically sci-fi dorks that are saying we're gonna set up like a sci-fi future and we run the shit.